This is an executive order that the president signed under a different legal authority, which some legal scholars say might not hold. It's a interesting reason why, but so it might not hold. But the really interesting thing about this new 10% scenario is that many countries, the president had assessed a tariff much higher than 10%. So this is a tariff break for a lot of countries.
First of all, for people who maybe aren't quite across what has happened with the tariffs, can you just explain what the Supreme Court decided was actually illegal?
Right. So the Supreme Court, which is the highest court in the land, ruled that President Trump had improperly used an Emergency Powers Act to impose tariffs. They said that this was not, this was an overreach of his executive authority, and that only Congress can levy tariffs on foreign countries.
And so in reality, what happens now overnight? Have those tariffs stopped? Has it immediately gone to this new 10% global tariff that Donald Trump then immediately announced?
Those are two separate questions. First of all, as for the tariffs themselves that were in place, I suppose importers will not have to pay them. But the really interesting question for me is what happens to the several $100 billion that have been collected since these tariffs were imposed, because the court ruling does not provide any sort of solution for that, because it's not the court's job. Their job is to rule whether you're constitutional or not to fix your problem for you or come up with a remedy. So that's the one question. As for the 10%, this is an executive order that the president signed under a different legal authority, which some legal scholars say might not hold. It's a interesting reason why, but so it might not hold. But the really interesting thing about this new 10% scenario is that many countries, the president had assessed a tariff much higher than 10%. So this is a tariff break for a lot of countries.
And this new 10% global tariff can only last for 150 days unless Congress backs it.
Right. And 150 days, half a year from now, I guess we'll still have the same Congress, but the margins are super thin. This just might not be a priority for this Congress.
How embarrassing is this for President Trump?
I think if you asked President Trump, he was clearly very angry. He said, I'm angry and I'm disappointed. So certainly he did see this as a type of defeat. But then he rallied and said, I'm just going to do this a different way. He said, if the Supreme Court closes a door, I'm opening a window and using a different authority to impose the tariffs. So how embarrassing is this for Donald Trump is you're going to get a different question whether you ask Donald Trump or many other people. We all know the acronym by now, TACO, Trump always chickens out. And that is resonating right now. But if you ask Donald Trump if this was embarrassing or a defeat, Donald Trump would almost certainly say no. And that's what he said, actually.
What is the reaction from US businesses, particularly those who've seen their business really hit hard from the tariffs?
Right. So businesses are relieved. We've heard from importers of products like European wines who've said that this is a big relief for them. Also, very interestingly, the governor of Illinois sent the president immediately after this ruling a letter demanding $1,700 per household in his state. That's what he estimates they've paid as a result of the tariff. That comes to $8.7 billion. And he sent the president this very aggressive letter saying basically pay up.
So what happens now for those companies that have paid those tariffs? You mentioned earlier on that money is effectively being held. Will there need to be presumably legal recourse to get that back? This could take an incredibly long time.
That's what the president said. He said this is going to be tied up in the courts forever. And I think that is a great possibility because, as I said, the Supreme Court didn't provide any sort of pathway for what they're going to do with this collected revenue. So it is likely that there is going to be some legal wrangling over how they resolve this.
I was reading that a man called Steve Becker, who's head of a law firm called Pillsbury, saying that the best thing for businesses would be if the government created a procedure that didn't require filing a lawsuit because that could take such a long time. Is there a sense that the government would be willing to help businesses in that way to make it easier for them to get access to that money?
Why would they? Why would anybody do that? I mean, yeah, sure. But this is also normal. This is the normal enforcement mechanism of of all sorts of executive actions. It is usually enforced by lawsuits. So I think that's part of the American system. Of course, this is going to be very difficult for some businesses. There is going to be a mountain of paperwork involved. But as for whether the government will assist them in returning that money, I don't see what impetus they would have to do that or to make that any easier.
Talk to us, if you would, about the makeup of the Supreme Court, because something that journalists have been making a lot of since this ruling came through is the fact that two of the justices were actually nominated by Trump. So you would automatically expect them to take a Trump view, which clearly they haven't done.
Well, I mean, I would remind you that our foundational documents say that we have an independent judiciary. Our courts are supposed to behave independently.
Sure, but then why would presidents put certain people in there? They're not going to put people in that are going to go against their viewpoint. As a general rule, we've seen that from Trump before.
We've seen that from Trump, certainly, but I don't think that's necessarily a reasonable expectation that the Supreme Court always agree with the President of the United States who appointed them, or even the President who's currently in power. I mean, I understand that logic, but that's not. I mean, these are lifetime appointments, so I don't think we can expect any sort of. I mean, the only loyalty that I think we expect our Supreme Court justices to show is toward the Constitution. And that's what they said that they followed in this 6-3 ruling. The justice that you mentioned that Trump appointed, Brett Kavanaugh, interestingly enough, in his dissenting ruling, he noted that there are other ways for the president to impose these tariffs. So he basically gave the president a how-to guide for how to get around this ruling.
I've read that people have described this as essentially a rare check on President Trump's power. Could this have implications beyond this? Are we expecting further rulings, or is this more of a political damage for President Trump?
Well, the finish line is really the midterm polls. Those are going to be in November, and a lot can happen between now and those polls. Right now, I'm kind of looking at the midterms and thinking, yeah, those polls are soft. We don't know who's going to pick up seats or who's going to lose seats. So what I would say just in response to that is time will tell if this was a significant blow to President Trump. I mean, his campaign centered around immigration enforcement, which is a big part of his actions. It's taken a lot of headlines, but the tariff policy, it's difficult to understand. It's complicated. I mean, I'm not sure that the president himself has a robust understanding of it. And we saw that when he imposed tariffs based on the trade deficit with those countries, which is economists said that was a very weird way to calculate tariffs based on trade deficits. I mean, the math kind of maths, but it also kind of doesn't make any sense because you end up with tariffs of outrageous amounts on countries that don't trade very much with the United States, or rather that don't buy very much from the United States, sometimes because they're low-income countries or they're tiny countries or whatever. So I don't know how much Americans are going to care about how this influences the president politically, but what I do think they're going to see are lower prices on imported goods, which is, of course, where Americans care the most in their pocketbooks. And of course, British people are the same.